Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we're currently in the process of updating our GPU benchmark data to make way for the upcoming GeForce 30 series. Earlier this week, we took a look at how the last three generations of flagship GeForce graphics cards compared in modern games, and despite the various architectural improvements of Turing, the GeForce 20 series doesn't appear to have evolved that much over the past few years. And today we're going to be taking that testing one step further by checking out the 2080 versus the 1080 Ti and then the 1080. So the $700 comparison between the 2080 and the 1080 Ti should be quite interesting. And then also just the sort of vanilla 2080 versus the 1080, that should also be quite an interesting comparison. But before we get into any of that, today's video is sponsored by ASUS and the new Ryzen gaming system available at PC Case Gear, packing a number of ROG Strix components for high-end performance, such as the ASUS ROG Strix B550E gaming motherboard and ROG Strix GeForce RTX graphics card for 4K gaming. I've already tested the B550E gaming and found it to deliver excellent VRM thermal performance along with a great feature set. It also includes a number of ASUS AI features such as AI networking, AI noise cancellation technology, and AI overclocking. For more information, please check the link in the video description. Upon release, the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti was roughly 30% faster than the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, and today it's still roughly 30% faster. So therefore, it was quite disappointing to see Nvidia charging 70% more for a GPU that's only 30, maybe 35% faster, particularly given that with the previous generation, we got 70% more performance for less than a 10% increase in price. Thankfully though, it looks like the upcoming GeForce 30 series will be much more of a substantial upgrade. We'll have all those juicy benchmark numbers to go over later this month. And of course, that's why we are in the process of updating all our benchmark data to give you the most up-to-date and accurate information possible. After the recent 2080 Ti versus 1080 Ti versus 980 Ti, a lot of you requested a 1080 versus 2080 comparison. So that's what we'll be looking at today. But I'm also going to add back in the 1080 Ti data, as that will make for a really interesting comparison with the 2080, given that both products came in at the same $700 US MSRP. On that note, it's also worth mentioning that the GeForce GTX 1080 was introduced back in May of 2016 at $600 US, and then roughly a year later was reduced to $500 US to make way for the GTX 1080 Ti. So that means for about a year and a half before the introduction of the RTX 2080, the GTX 1080 was a $500 product. And that means upon release, the RTX 2080 was priced to match the GTX 1080 Ti, making it 40% more expensive than the vanilla GTX 1080. Now here's a quick look over the specs for the three GPUs that we're focusing on today. The upgrade from the GTX 1080 to the 1080 Ti is pretty straightforward. The bigger die packs 40% more CUDA cores, and upon release, it was priced 40% higher. You also get an extra 3GB of VRAM and a wider bus for roughly a 50% increase in memory bandwidth. Then we got the RTX 2080, another $700 US GPU, this time produced using TSMC's 12nm process, and despite the node shrink and the reduction in CUDA cores, the die size actually grew by 16%, and that's of course due to the wider cores, supporting features such as ray tracing. So you can't really directly compare core counts, as the cores themselves are quite different. It's also worth noting that while the RTX 2080 received faster GDDR6 memory, it was limited to the same 8GB capacity as the previous generation GTX 1080. So this could be a problem for the RTX 2080 in its battle with the 1080 Ti at 4K, something that we're about to look into. Speaking of which, it is time to get into the benchmark graphs, and once again I'll be testing all three GPUs on our new Ryzen 9 3950X GPU test system, which sees no difference in performance at 1440p and 4K when compared to our 10900K test system. The first game we're going to look at the results for is Stranding, and here we're seeing some interesting performance trends. At 1080p, the RTX 2080 is clearly faster than the 1080 Ti, boosting performance by 14%, and that made it 36% faster than the GTX 1080. A nice increase, but not that amazing given it does cost 40% more. Typically, we are expecting to be a little bit CPU limited at 1080p, and therefore the faster GPUs should open up more at the higher resolutions such as 1440p, but here we're not seeing that. Rather, the margins are heavily reduced, and now the 2080 is just 7% faster than the 1080 Ti, though it's still 35% faster than GTX 1080. We do get some sense of what's going on here though, as we increase the resolution further to 4K. Now, there's virtually no difference in performance between the 2080 and the 1080 Ti, and I suspect this is due to the VRAM capacity. The extra memory of the older 1080 Ti is handing it an advantage here, enough of an advantage anyway that it can close right up on the newer Turing-based GPU. Next up we have Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and here the advancements made to the Turing architecture appear to be of little benefit as the 2080 and 1080 Ti deliver virtually identical performance. That means under the more playable conditions at 1080p, the 2080 was just 25% faster than the 1080 and then 29% faster at 1440p. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another game where the 1080 Ti and 2080 are very evenly matched, delivering virtually identical performance at 1080p and 1440p. We are seeing another instance where increasing the resolution to 4K does play into the 1080 Ti's favour, handing it an 8% performance advantage. Still, despite the 2080 and 1080 both featuring an 8GB buffer, frame rates are significantly better for the Turing GPU, boosting performance by just over 50%. So that's interesting, and I'd say it has to be a result of the extra 40% increase in memory bandwidth. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege makes heavy use of async compute, and with its hardware support, this is of huge benefit for Turing-based GPUs, such as the RTX 2080. As a result, the 2080 is seen to be 15% faster than the 1080 Ti at 1440p and 4K, while it was 56% faster than the GTX 1080 at 1440p and 59% faster at 4K. Granted, a 15% performance bump from one generation to the next is extremely weak, but the 2080 would have been a darn sight better if that was the average performance uplift. Interestingly, we're again seeing a small performance uplift for the 2080 at 1080p, with virtually no difference in performance between it and the 1080 Ti at 1440p and 4K. That meant the RTX 2080 was just 37% faster than the 1080 at 1440p and 34% faster at 4K. Again, reasonable performance uplifts there, but probably not ideal given that it does cost 40% more. Moving on, next up we have Gears 5, and here we're again seeing very competitive performance between the 2080 and 1080 Ti. The 1080 Ti was slightly faster at 4K, but we're only talking about 3 FPS here, so near enough to call it a tie. But I suspect the extra VRAM is starting to play a key role here. Then when compared to the GTX 1080, the 2080 was 25% faster at 1440p and 28% faster at 4K. Next up, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and this is another new and very demanding title. Despite that though, the 1080 Ti was right up there with the RTX 2080, trailing by just a few frames at 1440p and 4K. And as a result, the 2080 was just 30% faster than the 1080 at 1440p and 33% faster at 4K. And again, both margins are less than the 40% increase in price. Assassin's Creed Odyssey represents the kind of performance margins we saw 2 years ago when comparing the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti. Back then, in 27 of the 36 games tested, we saw a margin of 5% or less in either direction. Actually, if we focus on the 1440p and 4K data here, we're looking at no performance difference, and that was seen in about half a dozen of the games tested 2 years ago. Also, as we've seen a number of times now, the RTX 2080 is only about 25 to 30% faster than the GTX 1080 at 1440p, and while we have seen similar margins repeated a number of times at 4K, here we're seeing the increase in memory bandwidth of the 2080 playing a key role, helping it make up for the limited VRAM and allowing the Turing-based GPU to beat the GTX 1080 by a whopping 46% margin. Moving on to World War Z, and here we have a game that supports Vulkan, and this plays into the 2080's favour. It's not a big advantage, but the margin does open up to 9% at 1440p, though it closes back to 6% at 4K. Despite that, we're still only talking about a 37% improvement over the GTX 1080 at 1440p, though the 49% boost seen at 4K is much more substantial and certainly very noticeable. Metro Exodus was one of the first titles to take advantage of Nvidia's new RTX feature set, but despite that we see that it's not heavily optimized for Turing, as the 2080 and 1080 Ti basically delivered the same level of performance, and as a result the 2080 was 37% faster than the 1080 at 1440p, though as we found a number of times now, that margin blows out to 55% at 4K. Like what we saw with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we see virtually identical performance between the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti in Resident Evil 3. In fact, here we're seeing identical frame rates at all three tested resolutions. And the 2080 was also exactly 40% faster than the 1080 at both 1440p and 4K. Doom Eternal has some interesting and perhaps eye-opening results for us. Starting with the 1440p data, here we see a big 28% performance uplift for the 2080 over the 1080 Ti, and that meant the 2080 was 75% faster than the GTX 1080. So if these kinds of margins were the norm, then I'd say overall the GeForce 20 series would have been reasonably good. Now let's talk about the 4K results, as things look quite different here. Using the nightmare quality setting, Doom Eternal uses a boatload of VRAM, clearly more than 8GB, and a significant increase in memory bandwidth doesn't appear to make up the difference. In fact, here we're looking at almost 9GB of VRAM usage in our benchmark. Whereas the RTX 2080 was 75% faster than the GTX 1080 at 1440p, it's now just 29% faster at 4K, which admittedly is still a decent performance increase, but it means the 1080 Ti is now 11% faster than the RTX graphics card. Wolfenstein Youngblood shows similar performance gains to Doom for Turing over Pascal, but here we're not seeing the same extreme memory requirements at 4K. As a result, the RTX 2080 was 16% faster than the 1080 Ti and 65% faster than the 1080 at 4K. Finally, we have the Hitman 2 results, and like what we saw in Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Resident Evil 3 for example, there's no difference in performance between the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti in this title, and as a result the 2080 was just 33% faster than the 1080 at 1440p and 37% faster at 4K. Okay, so there was certainly some interesting results there, particularly at 4K, but what I want to do now is see how these GPUs compare on average across the 14 games tested, so let's take a look at that. No real surprises here. These margins look a lot like what we saw in a number of games, such as Death Stranding, F1 2020, and Horizon Zero Dawn, for example. At 1440p, the RTX 2080 was just 7% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti, with that margin closing to just 1.5% at 4K. Then when compared to the vanilla GTX 1080, the RTX 2080 was 44% faster at 1440p and 4K. That's a small improvement over the 33% margin we saw 2 years ago in our 36 game benchmark, which included a number of older games where the Turing architecture offered nothing over Pascal. At the end of the day though, we're looking at best case being single digit gains at the same price point, so not exactly the kind of improvement you'd expect from a next generation product on a node shrink. The battle of the $700 MSRP Turing and Pascal GPUs really does highlight just how disappointing the GeForce 20 series was when it came to general gaming performance. Basically, for the last 3 years, we've seen little to no improvement in cost per frame from the GeForce series, especially at the high end. Last year's RTX 2080 Super, for example, moved things along to the tune of about 5%, which is why we only made one and one only video focused on the 2080 Super. Beyond the day one coverage, there were no other AIB card reviews, for example, or head-to-head benchmarks. It was just a big fat nothing burger in my opinion. But with literally zero competition from AMD, it is difficult to grief Nvidia over their high-end lineup. The good news though being that it appears the upcoming next-gen consoles, along with the potential threat of the Radeon Technologies group finally getting their act together, has pushed Nvidia to produce some really compelling GeForce 30 series products. At least that's how it appears right now prior to any real benchmarks. But given what we've seen so far, it seems unlikely that the GeForce RTX 3070, 3080 and 3090 are going to disappoint. I'm not going to speculate as to how much of a performance gain the 3080 will deliver over the 2080. And yes, we have seen the Digital Foundry video, but a games list picked by Nvidia to highlight a best case scenario could be quite misleading. But let's just say we're looking at a 60% performance boost on average. Again, I'm not speculating, this is an example. If true, it would mean the 14 game average result at 4K goes from 62 FPS to almost 100 FPS, and that's a massive performance difference that you'll certainly notice. Again, I'm not claiming a 60% performance gain or anything like that, so please don't quote me on that. That's just an example I'm using to see what kind of gain that would net you at 4K. We'll just have to wait and see when reviews go live and the cards hit shelves on the 17th. One last thing I want to discuss is the 8GB VRAM buffer of the RTX 2080. It's clear that in some instances, a substantial increase to memory bandwidth can help alleviate capacity issues. However, we also saw one instance where the 2080 was completely overwhelmed and as a result fell well behind the 1080 Ti, despite easily beating the Pascal-based GPU at 1440p. So it seems quite clear that moving forward, 8GB of VRAM really isn't going to be enough for high quality 4K gaming. But for now at least, 11GB affords you some headroom. Therefore, I'd imagine the 10GB buffer of the 3080 will end up being right on the edge, And the 3070, which is said to be faster than the 2080 Ti, might struggle in the not too distant future at 4K without tweaking the quality settings, and given it only has an 8GB VRAM buffer. However, there is still the matter of bandwidth, and the 3070 does see a 14% increase in memory bandwidth over the 2080, hitting 512GB per second, though that is still 17% less than the 2080 Ti. The 3080 though, that sees a massive 23% increase in memory bandwidth over the 2080 Ti, and that should help make up for the 1GB of missing VRAM. Anyway, that's all stuff that we'll have to check out in future content. But I've got to say, the lackluster GeForce 20 series and AMD's inability to rise to the challenge really has set the stage for Nvidia to blow everyone away with the new GeForce 30 series. And I, for one, am very excited to check them out. So on that note, I'm going to end this video and get back to more GPU testing. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, there's the like button. You can subscribe for more content if you haven't done so already. And we do have a Patreon account for the Hardware Unboxed channel where you can become part of the Hardware Unboxed community. You get access to our exclusive Discord chat for Patreon members. We have a live stream that we do at least once a month. There'll probably be a couple of live streams coming up, well, this month, later in the month, after certain product releases. Behind the scenes videos, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff. If you're interested, links in the video description. Feel free to check that out. But other than that, thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve. I'll see you again next time.